Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and good to see so many of you. I want to thank you for coming out this morning. I'm reminded every time we convene in person that since the pandemic, you're never quite certain who's going to show up because, frankly, a lot of it sometimes has to do with how am I feeling this morning? Am I ready to get up and get out? There's a lot that we're going through, a lot of stresses, and then when we are leading and running nonprofits, there are the issues that pop up that sometimes derail our plans. So it's great to see so many of you here this morning. I want to thank you for joining us for what we've titled here at FPWA, Beyond Numbers, Empowering Human Services Through Fiscal Transparency. I'm Jennifer Jones-Austin, and I have the privilege of serving as the senior leader, the CEO of FPWA. I've been here now for 11 years and counting. 11 years. You know, I'll share with you a little secret, not so big a secret, but still like something we used to talk about privately. One of my very dear friends, Deputy Mayor Ann Williams-Isom, used to say, because I was forever jumping from one position to the next, she'd say to me, "You need to stay in place because people are going to begin to think that you have professional ADHD." So I think I've now proven her wrong. I can stay seated in one place, and that has a lot to do with like the work that we do here. Something like it gives me reason to get up in the morning. I feel valued. I feel like I get to work with a team that's doing critical work, and so I also get to work with all of you. I get to work with nonprofit leaders. I get to work with business leaders. I get to work with elected officials, faith leaders, community leaders. And I think what holds us all together is this common belief, this shared purpose that we're in the work to improve New York City, to improve the agencies that are doing the work on behalf of New York City, that are for those who are made vulnerable, have been made vulnerable. And so that's what keeps me here. That's what keeps you all here, I believe. And we're going to get this work together. We're going to do it as best we can. And that's what I've been trying to do for 11 years. You all the same. I'm proud to be hosting us here today. These are the FPWA facilities. I hope you feel at home. When this space was built out about 6 years ago, it was with the desire to make it a home for nonprofit, for government, where you could feel like, you got to come in and experience state-of-the-art spaces and have real meaningful engagement, convenings that are meaningfully and purposefully connected to the work that we do. So, who's in the room? Direct service providers? We got any direct service providers? Do we have community advocates? Public sector servants? Budget watchdogs. And perhaps we've got private sector leaders. Now everybody should raise their hands when I say concerned New Yorkers. Do we have any concerned New Yorkers in the house? This is good stuff. And I think that we're all here because we believe that a more equitable city for all New Yorkers is possible. Is that right? Yeah. I think our experiences, our expertise teaches us that with a strong human services sector, a more fair and equitable city is possible. At FPWA, we've been fighting for equity for over 100 years. Some of you may know, some of you may appreciate that the organization was actually founded at a time when social services were doled out based on race and religion. Thus, the Protestant in FPWA, Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. We were concerned about the experiences of children, mainly Black children, who they and their families were going without equitable and fair services. And so we came forward to be a voice at the table for them. And sadly, now 101 plus years later, we've still got to be that voice for people who've been made vulnerable. The blessing here is that we understand that it's not just Black people, brown people, people of Asian descent, and white New Yorkers that are often made vulnerable. So we're here for everybody, like many of you nonprofits. Key to our work, to the fulfillment of our mission, is sufficient government funding, and with it, budget transparency. Yet we all know that the funding of our sector has been needlessly complex, consistently shrouded in secrecy, and simply painfully inadequate. Lack of transparency into New York City's budget makes the difficult task of advocating for funding all the more arduous. How can we begin to unravel the city's complex budgetary documents when we already have to worry about chasing them down for late contract payments? And one of our guests today has been working very hard to do something about that. Thank you, Comptroller Lander. How can we begin to unravel the city's complex budgetary documents when we already have to worry about actually paying our employees, about whether the funds contracted for their critical services actually translate into wages that cover their living expenses? How can we take on another task when we're already being asked to do more with less? Nonprofits and human services agencies know that we deserve better. And the city of New York knows that we deserve better. Yet despite our persistent pleas for resources that could help calm the crises that we face, the city has chosen to fan the flames. The mayor's dramatic plan to cut 15% from agency budgets, regardless of need, under the guise of fiscal realities, was a stressor for both municipal employees and contracted nonprofit employees. Yet the initially reported $7 billion funding gap has been closed without the cuts initially called for by the mayor, with billions more in revenue and savings for more accurate asylum seeker costs, thanks in part to efficiencies found by this sector. These more positive projections have enabled the administration to restore some of the drastic funding cuts proposed, as was announced in November. But while significant savings were found by the nonprofit sector to help, the sector has yet to see or benefit from the planned restorations. In fact, additional cuts are being made to the arts, cultural institutions, older adult centers, and parks programs. Once again, we see the city prioritizing other services to the detriment of the nonprofit sector and at the expense of those that we serve, those already made vulnerable. With the New York City Funds Tracker, which we're about to talk about, we're seeking to help the human services sector gain control of the narrative, the city's narrative and ours. The New York City Funds Tracker is an interactive and user-friendly dashboard examining the last 12 years of New York City's revenues and expenditures. Through this backwards-looking analysis, we show the fiscal realities that human service agencies have had to navigate, with the tracker clearly demonstrating how the sector has been deprioritized in city budgets over the last decade, not just the last 2 years, but the last decade. We believe deeply in the necessity of this work. The story that the data tells can help give credence to the lived experiences of many of you who are here today. Too often, nonprofits are siloed and sidelined in budget conversations in favor of more powerful and centralized actors. At FPWA, we've been doing the work necessary to demystify human services funding for years. The first iteration of this project came in 2019, when FPWA launched a federal funds tracker due to expected federal cuts to local funding, which would impact the city's human services sector. FPWA's member agencies were very concerned, going back to 2017, when the former President Trump came in and began announcing significant cuts that would impact communities, community-based organizations, and people who already were struggling to make ends meet. We understood when trying to figure out the flow of federal funding back then in 2017 that, surprisingly, there was no tool that made critical information about budgets, federal, state, and local budgets, easily accessible for nonprofits dependent on government resources for services and service delivery. So we got to work and we built the Federal Funds Tracker. Tracking funding became even more critical and urgent during the pandemic, as nonprofits, you all know, as nonprofits had to mobilize around the crisis and demand for services grew, but it didn't seem like the money was coming. We continue to expand our analyses and public reporting and called for the city just last year, 2 years ago, to prepare in advance and budget accordingly for the foreseeable expiration of time-limited relief funding to avert another crisis tied to need and the sector's capacity to respond. We knew, we should have known, that the fiscal monies that had been made available for the pandemic were drying up, yet the city was not acting. The latest iteration of the funds tracker that we're launching today takes our analysis to the next level. Our senior fiscal policy analyst, Brad Martin, and fiscal policy analyst, Emily Pisano, have upped the game and provided the tools that we all need to more impactfully advocate for the funding that we need. The New York City Funds Tracker Dashboard enables the public to explore New York City's full stream of funding. It enables you all to explore New York City's full stream of funding, including both revenues and expenditures from the city, state, and federal levels, with a spotlight on human service agencies and the Department of Education. The expansion of our tracker tools is intended to help our sector, to help us both advocate for the funding we need and deserve, and to explore ways the city can create more sustainable revenue streams to support our work. The data in the New York City's Fund Tracker, which has been made possible by the Comptroller's office, is significant, but it only gains meaning from the way we share and build on it. We need the perspectives and the voices of everyone who's in this room to breathe life and meaning into the tracker and into our findings. We want to create today new connections that will allow us to expand and deepen this work. So, we need to get moving this morning to make this happen. Today, you're going to have a demonstration of the FPWA Funds Tracker, the new Funds Tracker dashboard. And before and after, we're going to have two important, dare I say, exciting conversations, one of which I'm looking forward to getting into in just a moment. We're going to begin with a fireside chat with our New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander, whose leadership in this moment, you're hearing it from me, whose leadership is invaluable. It's invaluable, particularly in this moment. We need Comptroller Brad Lander to keep doing what he's been doing. And we need to support him in that. So, we're going to have that fireside chat, then we're going to move to a short demo of the Funds Tracker Dashboard, the New York City Funds Tracker Dashboard, that'll be led by our Senior Policy Analyst, Brad Martin. Following Brad, we're going to take a short break. And then we'll have a panel. We're going to bring up an esteemed panel of panelists whose perspectives, informed by their positions, their posts, their experiences through the years, will help us reflect on the importance of bringing together perspectives from across the sector and even in government to engage on these critical issues of funding and budget transparency. I'm going to call their names and thank them in advance because I may not get the opportunity. We've got with us David Greenberg, who's the Deputy Director for Health and Human Services in the New York City Office of Management and Budget. We've got Louisa Chafee, who I've been riding and dying with for, goodness, now 20 years, who is the, I guess still it's safe to say, fairly newly appointed Director of the Independent Budget Office. We've got Jindasurat-Yasui, Vice President of Policy for Nonprofit New York, leader of the Coalition to Advance Nonprofits, and the Y15 Budget Advocacy Campaign. And we've got Sharon Sewell-Fairman, President and CEO of Women Creating Change. Now, I've had the privilege of working with and learning from all of these individuals, as well as from the panel's moderator, Marisa Rodriguez, who is FPWA's Chief Policy and Program Officer, who's been leading and guiding this critical work. So, the panel is going to be rich. And I encourage you all to join us for lunch afterwards, continue the conversation during lunch, and think about how we can continue the conversations even after this day. So, we're about ready to dive in, but before we do, let me just take a moment to acknowledge the team here at FPWA. Every single one of them. Nothing at FPWA happens in a silo. Nothing is just department specific. Everybody works together to make moments like these possible. And so I want everybody here at FPWA to know that I appreciate you, I value you, and I know that I can't stand up here or anywhere else and speak with confidence and conviction if I don't have you all doing the work that is so critical and so impactful in this moment. So thank you all. It's important. It's important for me to know that I thank you and I appreciate you. All right, so now we're going to get to the work. We're going to call up Comptroller Lander, and we're going to have a fireside chat conversation. And I'm going to be looking to you all for some cues.
Reveal? Yes. All right. So, Comptroller Lander, thanks for joining us.
Be here. I was a little skeptical of fireside chat because I'm like, where's the fire? But I'll say it's even better. I don't know if folks can see, but right across from us is a child care center. Now the kids have gone, but they were there just a minute ago, and I kind of feel like for the purpose of making visible the work of the human service sector, this is better than fireside.
Well,
Human service side.
I'm going to tell you, Comptroller, you've been bringing the fire. Right? Everywhere you're going these days, you're bringing the fire. And I think that is so important. If we don't speak up and speak out on the issues, then, we can't say that our voices have been heard. And we can't challenge or call for change if we're not doing our part. And so I want to thank you because you understand government, having served in government for several years in very meaningful ways. I remember meeting you when you were city councilman. You've always spoken up and spoken out, and sought change. You sought to be the change that we desperately need. And so you're here for a reason, and he's going to bring the fire.
Right.
All right. He's going to bring the fire. So let's begin with recognizing all the work that you've done in the last 2 years. Issuing reports, centering on issues that, I'll just put it out, the city of New York would rather not. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And doing so with an appreciation for budget transparency. So your job is to make the budget transparent, to hold the city of New York accountable. Tell us why this is so critically important, and especially in this moment.
And I think you can really see it in this moment where, unfortunately, in like our broader media ecosystems, it's not clear we even share a set of facts sometimes. And what transparency in government is about is just providing that basic level of common democratic understanding that's fundamental to the work. I sometimes joke because it's not the document that gets the most public attention, but one thing our office does every year is just puts the city's annual comprehensive financial report out. It's this big, thick thing that really, I don't know how many people look at it, but I look at it. It's what says, here's how much money we have in the bank, and here's who owes us, and here's who we owe. It's like a foundational level of knowledge that if we don't have that shared common democratic understanding, you kind of can't do anything else. And there's so much of the work of transparency that's like that, and so I'm delighted to be here today as you guys are launching this funds track, which I'm really excited to see. We've put out a lot of different trackers in my time. So we started saying, all right, we manage the pension funds. It turns out we just don't communicate who's managing our money. So we put out a really transparent pension funds tracker. Then some folks said, well, we would like to understand who those asset managers are. We had not disclosed, the basic demographic information, who's managing our money. So we did that. Then we got into agencies. I had a lot of concern about what was going on at Rikers. We put out a Department of Correction tracker. We are trying to make sure, what's our progress on climate? We've got a great climate dashboard, but the core elements of transparency for the Comptroller's Office for the city are about budget and financial information. So probably our most important transparency tool is this great tool called Checkbook NYC. And that's got every single check the city writes, every contract, every check, but it's an overwhelming stream of data. You can search it, But one thing we really love is when people take it and then say, all right, we're gonna make it more visible on the things we're especially shining a spotlight on. And so we're delighted that the data there is part of what's behind the funds tracker that you guys are releasing today.
So, the more transparent that you are in terms of the work that you do and helping us to appreciate what's happening, it seems the more annoyed others are. Is that? Yeah, we'll leave it there. Do you think that, is it that not everybody wants transparency? Is there more to it? And that's important for us advocates to understand. Is it that it's not easy to have transparency? Or is it that some would prefer that there not be transparency?
Well, I guess I think for all of us, accountability is hard, and I feel that at the personal level, you know what I mean? Like I get to scale out in the morning, and I don't really want the transparency, like I'm not excited about the transparency. I'd rather that scale was not in the bathroom. But otherwise, how am I gonna hold myself accountable, set a goal, make progress, make change, be honest with myself, adjust and course correct, and move in a direction? Like that's sort of it. And so I don't know that it's that much more complicated. Like accountability is hard. No one really wants to be held accountable. And that's what data and transparency is all about. And of course it's in pursuit of goals we share. And so yes, I give you one more example. So today we're releasing the annual contracts report. And that's, not always everyone's like, ooh, I'm excited for the contracts report, but I'm also excited for the contracts report. It won't surprise you to learn that despite the efforts that City Hall and we have made to speed up the timely processing of contracts, things keep going in the other direction, and a much higher percentage, especially of human service and nonprofit contracts, are registered late and paid late even than were last year or the year before. I'm not happy to tell folks that news, and then you take it to politics, and of course, if you're running for office, your job is going to be, or you think your job is going to be, to tell people, I'm doing great, things are going great, instead of, we're in a shared enterprise that's got some North Stars and some goals. We're going to be honest with you about the data. We're going to course correct when we get there. We're not happy with what the scale reads in the morning. We're going to revise our behavior. We're going to get our, and here's what we're going to do to get our nonprofits paid on time, or actually move in the direction of pay parity, or confront the racial wealth gap, or confront growing homelessness and a lack of affordability, rather than try to hide those things.
So we're going to move on because I really don't want to have the scale in my head this
Sorry.
It's really a great example because I think all of us have had that experience, and so it rings true. Let's talk about the human services sector and specifically about contracting and budgeting. I've been working with and engaged with the sector now for better than 25 years, both in government and outside of government. And the stories that I've heard, the stories that have been told in government and outside of government about fiscal improvements, lack of ability to manage effectively, redirecting resources where they shouldn't be, the budget's not squaring, people being over. The stories go on and on and on. Why contracts aren't paid timely. It has everything to do with the nonprofits and not with the city. In your last 2 years, or even when serving the city council, I'm sure there was a lot that you heard. Now, having the experience of serving as the fiscal watchdog, are there myths that you've heard about the sector that you can help us bust? Because that's critical to the narrative.
So I love this question, and I love being here with you and the leadership you've provided. As a lot of folks know, I've got a long and deep relationship to the nonprofit and human service sector. For 15 years before I was in the city council, ran 2 affordable housing nonprofits, so still half my career in the sector. And my wife, Meg Barnett, who leads Nonprofit New York, and you're going to hear from Chai later, has had her whole career in the sector. So for me, it's just a profound place of good work, but there is this myth, this idea that nonprofits are big-hearted, but not kind of hard-nosed, that they're not focused on outcomes, on getting the most from each dollar, and that the private sector will do that better. I think that goes along with sort of a bigger set of myths that we have to choose between good, strong management, competent management, and compassion in our organizations or our economy, or that in our economy we have to choose between one that's inclusive, that makes room for everybody to thrive, and one that's growing. And I just think all of those things are false. Like, an economy that includes people is more thriving, creates more jobs, has more opportunity, works better for everyone. Organizations that are well run do better at delivering good services and then have staff who feel good about them and thrive. And I see so many nonprofits who are working hard at paying attention to outcomes, at making sure they're doing everything they can with their resources. So often, unfortunately, forced to by that lack of resources. And I'll give you just one or two examples that have been profound to me. I'll start with the welcoming asylum seekers. So somehow there's this idea, the core of folks who have been providing homeless shelter and services to homeless folks, who have helped people get jobs, get on their path, are a lot of the nonprofits in the room. But for some reason, this administration has decided instead to put huge contracts toward for-profit businesses with no experience and no evidence that they, so instead of investing in the sector, the biggest contracts have gone to organizations like this for-profit medical staffing company called DocGo, which the city has now given well over $500 million in contracts to, despite the fact that it had no experience providing shelter or services for asylum seekers, and was pretty transparent. The whole reason they wanted these contracts from the city was to try to get even bigger contracts from the federal government. Like, they told that to their shareholders. And what they made clear, if you look at their stockholder calls, was that if their outcomes were not, how many people are we going to help get on their feet, get jobs, get the work authorizations, get the pathways that they need, but what's happening to our stock price? And are we getting big contracts from the federal government? Like, those were the numbers that they were paying attention to. On the other hand, I happened one day to go with WIN, formerly Women in Need, one of the great shelter providers. They had started long before the city, long before any of these for-profit contractors, saying, what we need to be doing is not just focusing on the shelter rooms, but on the pathways to help people file their asylum applications, get TPS, temporary protected status if they're eligible, get case management and workforce development, then folks could get work authorization and jobs, and move out of shelter, which of course is what everybody wants to do. And thanks to WIN and New York Legal Assistance Group and the network of nonprofit legal services providers, the city was kind of shamed into saying, hey, that is what we should be doing, and start to stand up those programs themselves. And again, some might have said, well, that's compassion on the one hand, in what WIN and NYLAG were doing, versus hard-nosed financial management on the other. And yet it turns out to be dramatically more cost-effective, as well as more effective in human outcomes, to invest in the pathways for people to thrive.
Absolutely. As you speak, I'm getting fired up. No pun intended. Because I'm thinking about how one of the greatest myths about the human services sector is that it's not getting the job done. Because people who are cared for by the human services agencies throughout New York City continue to live on the edge. Can't move beyond poverty level wages. They languish in poverty, they languish in need, and it's just this cycle that continues. It just it's like rinse and repeat. So what's the human services sector doing? Is it any good, right? And for me, and I believe I find a kindred spirit in you, given some of the work that you've done, most recently the release by the Comptroller's Office of the Racial Welfare Report. This appreciation that we have a sector, one of the biggest myths of the sector is that it can solve all of these problems. Whereas the problems that people often are showing up with, begin with systemic economic inequity and deprivation. And so if you have a sector that's responding to a crisis in is not being supported to look at the structural economic inequities that persist in our city, in our state, in our nation. You know, we're gonna be able to do but so much. And if we're underfunded and not funded to take care and tackle that piece, then the narrative will continue to be, you're not getting the job. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, this was such an important point. I'll give a couple of examples. We just did this report that you mentioned on the racial wealth gap. And this was prompted because State Senator James Sanders and Assembly Member Michelle Solage were working on a reparations bill, and they said, Comptroller, could you take a look at this data? And I knew it wasn't going to be good, but I was still stunned by what it showed. So the median net worth of a white household in New York is $277,000. That is 15 times the median net worth of a black household in New York, which is just shy of $19,000. And actually Latino household net worth even lower, shy of $12,000. So that's a 15 to 1 gap between black and white household wealth. But of course, then you say, well, what does that really mean? Because $277,000 is enough for the median white family to give some money to your kid for a down payment, or pay for college, or survive a medical emergency, or have some retirement security. And $18,000 is not enough to do any of those things. Like, you're gonna get wiped out in a medical emergency. You sure can't help people with a down payment, or pay for their college, or retire comfortably. That's the difference between a life of some stability and a life that doesn't have it. And you can't really make up for that with a little bit of services here or there. I mean, it's great if you then have childcare that is good and paid for, and you don't have to come out of pocket for it. So those services matter. If you don't have good childcare for your kids, then you're going to even pass the deprivation on intergenerationally. But even if you get that affordable childcare, you're still not any closer to those other things I just mentioned. So the services are critical, but they can't overcome that level of wealth disparity. Then of course we compound that, because certainly one of the best ways to help people get what they would need to build wealth is higher education. And yet here we are with a budget that's cutting CUNY, which is the most significant way that New Yorkers of color and low-income working class New Yorkers are going to have a shot at education.
Right, and let's just add, we see very often that you'll see all too often that even women, and particularly black women, the most educated segment of our society, have more college and graduate degrees than any other segment of the society. Yet, on average, are earning 64 cents for every dollar earned by a white man. And even in corporate America, where they may be making more than typically low wages, or in positions that due to occupation segregation are marginally low, they're still not making as much.
Oh, even in our contracting, we're about to put an audit out on the pay disparity in the childcare sector. So despite the fact that there were big announcements about pay parity, we have not achieved even what we promised a couple of years ago, and we also pegged it too low, so that teachers in the city system, in the Department of Education, make significantly more than teachers teaching basically the same kids, the same thing in community-based organizations and human service organizations, but you're significantly more like much higher percentage of women of color in the CBO sector than FPWA, making billions of dollars.
So I want to just take a second to thank you for the work that you did on the racial gap in New York, and appreciating that it is helping to inform the work that is now being done at the state level, centering on reparations. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, are you in the camp of reparations should be about individual compensation, or should it be in the camp, in the space of looking at how we as a nation change our structures and our systems in a way that kind of moves changes things materially, sustainably.
Yeah.
How's it been going?
Yeah, well, the framing here that I like the best is, I don't know if people have seen Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, which I really think is magnificent if you haven't read it, because it goes through with a really harsh look at the racial wealth gap, and at the politics that have gotten us there. She talks about what she calls drain pool politics, which looks at communities where when the public swimming pool was integrated, whites who did not want to integrate their swimming pool closed the swimming pool, the public pool, rather than integrated, making everyone in the community more miserable. And how many different parts of our economy that's true of. And if you can, flip that on its head, you get what she calls a solidarity dividend, because when you enable more Black and Latino folks to open businesses, then everybody does better. Like, your economy's more flourishing and you've got something better in the community. So
Tell them what your MWBE report tells us about black persons in New York City with respect to getting contracts.
I wish I didn't have to tell you this one. Black and Latino New Yorkers are 52% of New York. What percent of New York City's contracts do you think they get? So, and that's not, the broader economy. That's New York City's contracting. And yeah, that hurts all of us because, regardless of what happens in the contracting itself, that means a majority of New Yorkers aren't getting the resources, the investment, the wealth to start businesses that help their communities flourish and thrive. There's a lot of good evidence that Black and Latino owners are more likely to hire Black and Latino workers to create upward mobility opportunities. And I'll give just one more example here because I didn't exactly answer your question.
But you're connected looking at individual versus systems change.
Let me give you one program that I think is kind of does both. Maybe the best housing program in New York City's history is the Mitchell-Lama co-ops, which were in their time in the kind of 50s and 60s, an investment in neighborhoods, but that created pathways to affordable cooperative homeownership for working class families. We mostly stopped doing that. Now the vast majority of our affordable housing dollars are subsidies to for-profit private developers, overwhelmingly white men, to build their wealth by building rental housing that, yes, provides an affordable rental opportunity for people who need it. So we have to debate, how affordable is it and who it's for and how long it stays affordable. But even at best, then enables those folks to get by, builds the wealth of mostly already wealthy white men. Instead, if what we would do is reboot programs like that Mitchell-Lama program, we're just as capable of doing it now as we were then, but we'd have to do something different. We'd have to say, when we give more density bonuses or tax breaks or subsidies, that's going to go to, essentially, either nonprofit developers, or you can even work with some for-profit developers, but it winds up as a co-op in the hands of the community, of the people who own it, of the folks who live there. And you can't sell it at market rate if you live in a Mitchell-Lama, but it does appreciate over time. You can pass it on to your kids. You can borrow against it when you want to send them to college. So that's a way, when I talked about those numbers for Black and white households, most people's net worth is in their homes. If we are going to make it possible for people of color to begin to build intergenerational wealth and confront systemic inequities in our communities, it's that kind of policy shift we have to make.
I really appreciate you using that example because it speaks to the challenge. So many of us in this room, so many of us in this world came into this space not to be poverty managers, not to just be about the business of helping secure relief for people who are, financially challenged. But we were centered on how do we materially and sustainably help people get to a better place and stay there. And so when we as a sector are forced to, make choices that really only help us to provide a bit of the relief that is necessary, when we cannot look across, the sector or beyond the sector. Look at the intersectionality of these issues. When we can't be out there advocating for programs like Mitchell Mama, because we're so, strapped, just trying to, make sure that we keep the lights on, then we're not able to do the job that we set out to do. And so, help us appreciate, given all the challenges that we're seeing, given that we sometimes can't even get out of the office to engage, how can we best work together, work with you, work with government, work as a collective body to press for transparency, and with it the resources that are needed, both to help people in the moment, but to help people in ways that benefit them for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question, and I'm glad you guys are starting. We get to help start the conversation because I know there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in the room about how to do that. Because it does mean doing a few things together. I mean, fiscal transparency is critical, for looking at the city's budget. It's important for all of us. I mean, I'm going to go back to that scale metaphor. I'm sorry, but it is valuable for all of our organizations. We're doing it internally in the Comptroller's office, and I know the sector does it as well. You kind of don't want to air dirty laundry in public, but the work of holding ourselves to strong management while we're holding the city to strong management is one important thing to do. And I think when folks are kind of doing that and saying, look, here's how we're working to achieve good results, that helps the public be like, okay, I can have some confidence in that organization. Then there's, how do we inspire people, which I think is so much of what you, Jennifer, and so many people in the room are doing, of showing the inspiring stories about what it looks like when it works. I'll tell you one. The most inspiring New Yorker I've met in the last couple of months is this young woman named Yaris Lopez, who I first heard at the Robin Hood breakfast. She was the speaker kind of nominated by the New York Legal Assistance Group. I mentioned that earlier, great legal services nonprofit. Yaris is Garifuna. She grew up on the Caribbean coast of Honduras. And when she was 11, rival gangs tried to burn down their house. Her mom scooped Yaris and her sister up and walked here. They were in those Trump ice boxes, they call the warehouses on the Texas border. They made it to New York. They wound up homeless. Her mom then took up with a guy who was abusive, and so now they're really at their lowest point. In the Bronx Family Justice Center, like a center of nonprofits that's trying to say, all right, let's have people out of criminal justice system involvement. A NYLAG lawyer finds them, helps them get housing away from the abuser, gets them out of shelter and stood up in housing, helps with their asylum case, helps Yaris transfer to a different high school in the Bronx where she graduates as valedictorian after just having come to the country not speaking any English. She's going to graduate with honors this spring from Lehman College, and last summer she volunteered at NYLAG because she wants to be an immigration attorney, since it was this immigration attorney who saved her life and helped a couple of families win their asylum cases. And she is going to be a leader of New York City, and you can see in that family's story the kind of trajectory that we want for our kids, whether or not we had to go through trauma, anything like that. And, so I think where we can both show the numbers, show we're working hard at good hard-nosed management, that we've got outcomes, that we know how the numbers work, and lift up these kind of inspiring stories that both show individual success, but also draw out that compassion. It's not just that Yaris is gonna do well, make money, be able to buy her mom a house, though I think all those things, but that she is gonna contribute to the kind of inclusive compassion of New York City that so many of us crave and desire. And this sector, the for-profit sector isn't gonna get you stories like that. Government mostly isn't gonna get you stories like that. It is the human service sector. It shows that is possible in ways that I really think still have the capacity to inspire us.
I'm inspired. Are you all inspired?
Yes.
I'm inspired by her story. I'm inspired by you. By my children tease me all the time because they say that I often say, when talking about somebody, oh, I like the way she's showing up in the world. I like the way they're showing up in the world. I really appreciate, value the way that you're showing up in the world that is New York City in this moment. Before we leave, tell us, you're producing great information. You know, you're bringing transparency forward in a way through your reports that is so accessible. We're going to talk about the funds tracker in a minute, the New York City funds tracker, seeking to be the same. Is there anything in particular that we should be looking out for? We all should visit your website because there's some great material. But is there anything that is on the horizon that you want to give us a preview about?
All right, I think I already teased 3 things, but I'll go back and do them. So today you got that annual contract summary report coming out, and that sadly will confirm that you guys aren't getting paid on time. We have this pay parity report in the child care sector coming out that has some numbers coming. We've got our next MWPE report for 23 coming out of caucus weekend. This is exciting. I don't know, Krista, what else? We got the budget report. Yeah. So every time that the mayor puts out a budget, Krista Olson, Deputy Comptroller for Budget, and our whole budget team dig in and do a deep dive on what's in there, what the cuts are, what the pegs are, what the real story is about your budget gaps, which we do have and have to manage thoughtfully, and then ways we could do that, that are smart, that'll put the city on a sound fiscal footing, but also make the investments that help us thrive in the future. And I promise we'll keep them coming.
It sounds great. Well, we're going to have you back here at FPWA so we can stay in the know, be informed. My dad used to say, gain knowledge, gain power, and you will bring in the knowledge and bring in equips us with the power to do what we can help them all. So I thank you, I appreciate you, and I look forward to further conversation with you all.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Comptroller, for such an insightful discussion. What a way to start the day. My name is Brad Martin, and I'm the Senior Fiscal Policy Officer here at FPWA. Yes, another fiscal policy nerd named Brad. I'm excited to be with you here today to launch our new NYC Funds Tracker. The NYC Funds Tracker is an interactive dashboard which will be hosted on our website that provides a historical overview of the city's revenue and expenditure. But what do we actually mean when we're talking about tracking funding? What we're doing is looking at all the different ways the city gets its money and then looking at how it spends it. That is, we're looking at both how the city divides the pie, but also the size of the pie. The tracker provides information about where the money comes from and where the money goes, with a focus on what this means for our city's vital human services agencies. It's intended to shine a light on the fiscal workings of the city government and can be used by advocates, policymakers, anyone here in this room who wants to learn more about the city's funding decisions. As part of today, I'm going to go over 2 main things. Firstly, I'll provide an overview of the dashboard, and then after that, I'll go over a report we are releasing today alongside it, the NYC Funds Tracker report, where we share some of the key findings that we've found using the dashboard. Before we go into the demonstration, I just want to take a moment to go over how we got to where we are today. So as Jennifer mentioned, the Funds Tracker is the next step in a series of work FPWA has been leading for 2019 and earlier, all focused on tracking funding. I won't go into too much detail, but I think the main thing to highlight here is that what we're trying to do with this new version of the tracker is really broaden the approach that we're taking so that we can look at the different trade-offs that the city has to grapple with. So FPWA has been highlighting these issues for years. For example, we've long been sounding the alarm on the impending expiration of time-limited COVID-19 funding that is now impacting our city. The NYC Funds Tracker marks the next step in this work. So what actually is the NYC Funds Tracker? It uses information about actual revenue and actual expenditure released by the Comptroller's Office through Checkbook NYC. And it really goes to that information that's released in the annual comprehensive financial report that Brad spoke about. But instead of having to flip through hundreds of pages, you'll have it there at your fingertips. So we've taken that information and put it into an interactive dashboard. As the city looks to FY25, the tracker provides historical context to inform advocacy about today's budget decisions. We know that budget decisions don't happen in a vacuum, and that the current state of the budget is a sum of many decisions that have been made over time, which is why we take that historical look back. When we have the language and the tools to know and understand city funding, with the expertise in this room, together we can go beyond numbers. You have to forgive me for that one. Before I take you through the tracker, I just want to retouch on the scope of what it is and what it isn't. So first, as I mentioned, the funds tracker is a backwards look at what has actually happened. The next thing is that it takes a citywide view. So it's really about that big picture. It's not looking at the individual service agreements that you can get through some different data sources. Finally, we see this as version 1 of a new product that we want to continue to grow and evolve. So at the end of the presentation, I'll give you some information about how you can connect and get in touch so we can continue to work together and update this to make sure it's as useful as possible for everyone here. Now, without further ado, I'm going to step through some of the features of the tracker. So this view here is the first thing you'll see when you go to our website, and this is the main page of the tracker, and it shows a view of the most recent fiscal year, which in this case is FY23. We can see that the city had about $108 billion in revenue and about $100 billion in expenditure. The difference was mainly used for servicing debts. On the left side of the tracker in the blue, we show the different revenue sources of the city, or where does the money come from. We can see that taxes are by far the biggest contributor to the city's revenue, followed by state and federal grants. On the right-hand side, we show budget expenditure, or where does the money go. So we've made a deliberate decision on this side to focus on the human services agencies. So there are about 50 odd agencies that the city provides funding to. So rather than having them all and it being overwhelming, we've had to group the other agencies together as one group so that we keep the focus on human services. But that other agency group is where you'll find agencies such as NYPD, Department of Sanitation, pretty much everything else that's not there on that list. So this is the overall view that you get when you go to the tracker. Then on the left-hand side of the tracker, there's a few different buttons there, and that's where you can go to navigate the more interactive components, and we'll really get into the more historical analysis. So now I'll just go through each of these buttons, and as I go through, I'll highlight some different examples of how the tracker might be used. Okay, so we'll start by exploring the question of where does the money come from. Perhaps you're interested in how the city's different revenue sources have changed over time, and this is what we can see here. The user can navigate to different views using these buttons along the top, and we also have the option to adjust the numbers for inflation, and then also to change the view we have. Now back to our question of how the city's revenue has changed over time. We can see that taxes in the red has increased at a faster rate than federal and state grants, which are these two sort of flat lines there at the bottom. And what this shows is that revenue has grown while federal and state funds have remained relatively stagnant, and this means that the city now shoulders a greater share of revenue to fund its expenses. That is, the cost burden is shifting towards the city. So why do we care about this? We care because this exposes the city to greater volatility. Tax revenues are more susceptible to changes in economic conditions, and this is important because we want to ensure that the city has sustainable revenue growth to fund the services that so many New Yorkers rely on. And when we look at the different funding sources between the city, federal and state, it's clear that all levels of government play their part. Okay, so this is a view of overall revenue. Now the dashboard also gives us the option to delve into this a little further. So for instance, after looking at this and seeing that federal and state funds have remained relatively stagnant relative to the city's own revenue, Someone might want to unpack this more to discover what it means for human services agencies. For this, we have the grants button. This page allows a user to view federal and state grants to human services agencies and the Department of Education. So let's imagine that we're an advocate that is specifically interested in what's happening with state and federal grants provided directly to an individual agency. Let's say the Department of Social Services. In this case, the user can click on the state versus federal button, which allows them to select which agency or agencies they want to view. Here, the user can select DSS to view only DSS funding. When we do this, we can see that federal and state funding paid directly to DSS has decreased since FY11. If the user wants to investigate this in more detail, they can now click on the top grants view. So this has retained the DSS selection, and the user can now observe what's happening to the top state and federal grants for DSS. As you can see, TANF provided directly to DSS in the green line there is at the lowest level in real terms since 2011. So that's just an example of the sort of digging that you can do using the funds tracker into individual agencies and individual state and federal grants. So the views that we've walked through so far are all focused on the revenue that the city receives. The city then takes this revenue and as part of this budget process allocates it to agencies. So this is the expenditure side now, or the question of where does the money go, which we'll walk through now. In this view, we can see other agencies' budget expenditure growth in the grey line. Just take the video. And this is sort of the corresponding view to the revenue side. So once the city receives the revenue, this is how it's spending its money. The other agency is in the grey line, education in red, and then human services there, each with their own line. And again, we have the ability to change how the view is presented using the buttons there. And as you can see on the human services agencies, they've stayed relatively flat compared to funding for other agencies. And we have another view that you can go into that a little bit more. And now this last view that we have combines the information that we've talked through about the revenue the city receives and this expenditure side as well. So what we're trying to explore in this last view is the relationship between the city's revenues and its expenditures on agencies. We're wanting to explore how the expenditure decisions the city makes are dependent on the resources or revenue it has available. So what the graph there is showing is that revenue and expenditure, as you would expect, broadly track each other, but then you're also able to go and select different agencies to see, well, is this revenue tracking the same for all agencies? So if you look at the non-human services agencies, you can see that they're sort of tracking a little bit above revenue. But then if you look at other agencies such as Department of Social Services, budget expenditure at DSS has remained relatively flat despite increasing city revenue. So there's really a lot of data in the dashboard, and we've made it so it can be sliced and diced in a lot of different ways depending on what you're interested in. So just back to the main page now. So those four buttons that I've just walked through, they're the main interactive components. The tracker is launched today, so really excited for everyone to get onto our website and use it. Also, I'll point out on the bottom left of the dashboard, we have a few buttons to some external resources. So the first one is the dashboard data. So we're making the underlying data in the dashboard available for anyone who wants to download it and do their own analysis. So this is the data that we've taken from Checkbook, but we've done some extra work to clean it and also done that work to adjust numbers for inflation. So if you want to use any of that, feel free to download and do your own thing. We also have a link to our latest budget analysis, which is where we, FPWA provides our own analysis of the latest financial plan adopted by the city. And then finally, we have a link to our funds tracker report, which is the other part of what we're releasing today, and is what I'll talk through now. So the Funds Tracker report that we're releasing today provides an overview of the current state of the city budget, much like the dashboard. But what we've done is drawn out some of the key findings that we've found by using the dashboard. The report focuses on some of the big picture findings we've chosen to highlight, but as I said, there's a lot more than what's covered in the report that you can all go in and find out in the dashboard, depending on the specific agencies or grants you're interested in. So as I talk through some of the findings on the report, there's two main timelines that we look to. So firstly, we had a look at what happened in the most recent complete fiscal year, FY23, and then we also took a look back at what's happened over the longer term. So starting with our most recent year, I'll move relatively quickly through this one because it's the same as what we saw on the dashboard in terms of the split between city, state and federal funding, and then how the city uses its money. The main takeaway from this is actually when you compare these numbers to FY22, after adjusting for inflation, these numbers actually represent a decrease in revenue and expenditure compared to FY22, and that's the first year on record in the Funds Tracker that that's happened. So the reason for that decline, there's there's a few different ones, high inflation, but one of the things we did find is that there was a 37.6% decrease in federal funding. So this is important to note because it does go to some of the things that we've been raising for a long time, and also does confirm some of the realities that we are operating in a constrained sort of budget environment. This decrease in federal funding is not the only reason that we find ourselves in the state that we're in, but it is indeed one of them. The other thing we saw is when we looked specifically at human services funding, FY23 was actually, they fared relatively quite well, but this comes off record lows in FY22, which we highlighted in our previous Funds Tracker report. So now on this slide here, I'll talk to some of the longer term trends that we found. So this is when we look back between FY11 and today. And I think this is the real value of the Funds Tracker because it's where we take a bird's eye view. So we're not looking at decisions made by a single administration or by a single level of government. We're really looking across everything. And you can see that the findings are quite concerning, particularly how state and federal funding to the city has stagnated over time for our human services sector. So these are the funds that are provided from federal and state sources directly to human services agencies. And we highlight there a few of the agencies that have mainly had reductions, with DSS and ACS being the main ones. So now moving to the expenditure side, despite the stagnant state and federal grants, the city's expenditure has still grown over the past 12 years. And what we found is while the city's overall budget expenditure has increased, this has not been shared evenly. So while expenditure for other agencies has increased by 34%, human services have seen only a 16.8% increase in their budget. If we just stop for a second, this means that human services have received half the funding increases compared to non-human services agencies over the past 12 years. Now we know that some of this would be driven by the decrease in direct federal and state grant funding that we saw in the previous slide, but it's not the only reason. It's also budget decisions that are being made. So all levels of government play a role. So in summary, what does this all mean? For the city as a whole, we're seeing a shift in the cost base. So this means that the city is having to fund a greater share of its operating budget through its own sources in response to decreasing federal and state funding. This leaves it more exposed to economic ups and downs. For human services specifically, decreases in state and federal funding are being compounded by budget decisions made at the city level. While FY23 saw some modest improvements in human services funding. These increases make up a mere fraction of the multi-year coordinated divestment that has taken place since FY11. So it's not something that we're seeing from just a single level of government or a single administration. This is a sustained long-term trend that we're observing, where human services are not a priority. And so just to take the conversation back to today, it does paint not a pretty picture, but I hope that it shows some of the information that you can get from the funds tracker and provides a bit of context to where we are today and also for our discussion that we're going to have after the break. So that's the tracker and the report. I hope you're all excited about it as we are. I want to give a shout out to Zoe and Emily who are hiding in the back over there. We got the real brains and muscle behind this. If you're interested in talking to us about it, come find us in the break. I'd love to talk about all of this stuff. I also have my email on the screen there so we can keep in touch. And on the Funds Tracker website, we're going to have a form where you can submit ideas or ideas to collaborate, or just if you want to stay in touch with the tracker. So, thanks. Now we'll have a short break. Feel free to stretch your legs, grab some food, and we'll be back here in 15 minutes for what's sure to be a great panel discussion.
Good morning. Still good morning, so that's still safe. I hope you all are learning tons, are generating great ideas for collaboration and action. I'm excited to move to this part of the program. My name is Louisa Rodriguez. I'm Chief Program and Policy Officer here at FPWA. And I am looking forward to this conversation with great partners. I had time to kind of read off their bios, but we have printed a program. I hope each of you have one. If not, they are outside, and their bios are in the program. I'd much rather use that time for our conversation. And should we have time left, we can be in community talking about what we've learned, where we go from here, etc. So thank you again, and let's welcome our panelists. To reiterate, we have David Greenberg from OMB, and I have to say, I personally have had the pleasure of working with David using several other hats in advocacy spaces. And I know he's been a real partner to the nonprofit sector, so welcome, David. We have Louisa Chafee from Independent Budget Office. I too go way back with Louisa, dating back from our time in the mayor's office during Bloomberg administration and as partners in nonprofits. Welcome, Louisa. We have Sharon Sewell-Fairman. Welcome, Sharon. I am so looking forward to dig into your passion around gender equity and pay, and so thank you for joining us. And we also have Jindasurat-Yasui from Nonprofit New York. And Chai and I recently started working together, and I have to tell you, I've talked to many stakeholders where I'm like, you have to look out for Chai. He is a fearless leader in this space and really doesn't shy away from the truth. So I welcome you all. I want to start off by appreciating the fact that we all know the value of data, right? I think that the core of this conversation is about data and budget transparency. We know the value of data in policymaking, in budget decisions, in practices, in advocacy. But data alone doesn't tell a full story, right? And I think you heard both in our opening remarks and in the conversation at the fireside chat earlier this morning, that data in itself, it doesn't tell a full story. What we need is perspectives, our own experiences to really add relevance and meaning. And so I would love to start just there with your unique perspective. We have a diverse panel ranging from government to nonprofit to nonpartisan work. And so I'd love to hear from each of you, what is the value you see in this work, in this tool? how do you see its advantages in your respective work? And maybe we can just go down the line. David, if it's okay, we can start with you.
Sure, can you hear me? One, I'd like to thank FPWA and Jennifer Jones-Austin. The last time we were in this room was announcing the indirect cost rate initiative, so it's a special space, and thank you again for hosting this, and also the data tracker. I think, you know, from the OMB perspective, we put out budgets consistently throughout the year, and the numbers change, and it can be very confusing. And we internally, I'm looking at my staff who came with me, the year-end close, I'm gonna sound very technical now, but the numbers that feed into the tracker that come from the CAFR, those are accurate. Like, that's what we look at as this is what happened in the year. It's not a projection, it's not an estimate, this is actually what we spent, this is how the grants came in. And looking at it historically, I think is a very useful way of tracking trends over time. And so I think that's a smart way to look at it. And it's one layer of the story. And so I think that there's more that can be built off of it, but this is a very good starting place to see historically how the different revenue streams have funded to our different agencies.
Thank you. Good morning. Okay, I too need to thank Louisa and Jennifer, and I'd just like to point out that everyone has said I've been working with them for a really long time. I believe one of the people in this panel was once my student, which makes me feel even older. Spectacular student. So I am now with the Independent Budget Office, which is a city agency created to be, as the name would say, independent of other agencies and about the budget. And I've had the pleasure of working there for about 9 months. And a huge part of the challenge that we have is trying to explain the universe of what's going on. So we love this tool because it's summing everything up in one place and creating a visual story. We are really good at writing very long papers. Sometimes we're a little shorter, but to be able to look at charts and see can literally, you know, a picture tells 1,000 words or whatever the saying is wrong. So what we load it as a critical tool for people trying to understand how their government is making choices, whether they're for or against them, to see the direction the government is going. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank Louisa and Jennifer, and I want to say that Jennifer, she's just an amazing leader, and what I really respect about her over the years is that she does her homework, and she's not afraid to speak truth to power, and that's really something that we all aspire to. So let me just say, when I was growing up, my sister and I used to watch Saturday morning cartoons, and there was this saying that says, "The more you know," on NBC, right? And as I grew up, am I aging myself? Are there other colleagues in the room, right? And so as I grew in my career journey and my leadership, I adopted the mantra, you don't know what you don't know until you know, and knowledge is power. So I'm really thrilled about the New York City Funds Tracker and its comprehensiveness, right? Because at Women Creating Change, which is literally 10 months on the job, our goal is to help women, to educate women around their to increase civic education and participation, to also equip our community with the necessary tools, resources, and connections to advance gender equity in New York City. And we do that by leveraging tools like the Funds Tracker, right? And the bottom line is we need to raise awareness, right? And we do need to be able to equip individuals to not only self-advocate, but advocate for their families and their communities. And the way we start, just seeing what we've seen with the information so far with the Funds Tracker, it is very, very important to look at the big picture and to understand the structural and systemic challenges we face, especially in the human services sector, and we'll talk more about that later.
All right, I guess I get to go last. Good morning, everyone. I would also like to thank FPWA and FPWA. You all have done such an amazing job on this excellent tool, and it's a really honor to be a part of this panel and to be here today. So I'm coming at this from a couple of different perspectives. At Nonprofit New York, we are a membership association of 1,100 nonprofit organizations across the greater New York City metro area. And so we're often looking at things at a very high level. I'm in my 5th year now. I was at OMB right before. Louisa and I worked on the indirect in my capstone project at Wagner. But I worked in nonprofits before that. I worked for an organization that I was doing advocacy, but we provided services and we had city, state, and federal contracts. And what I think is so powerful about this tool and all of the research that FPWA has been putting out for all the time that I've been collaborating with FPWA is that it's grounded in an association, a membership association. It's grounded in organizations that are doing the work, that have to worry about the people that they're serving, the communities they're serving, and the people who are working in those organizations and making payroll. And I think that those considerations are really, really important. It's really important for us to have this high quality, excellent data from organizations that are grounded in community. Because so often, it comes from think tanks. It comes from public data sources, which are great, and analysts who are doing really good things, but who knows if those recommendations are actually grounded in the lived experience of people running those organizations who are in communities. And that's why I think it's so powerful that you're putting out such an excellent tool for the public and for us as advocates so that we can, because we don't know, we can't define a problem unless we have good data. And then we can't define our solutions unless we have good data. So it benefits all of our advocacy to have this data.
Thank you all. David, I want to start off with you a little bit. As we heard this morning, the New York City's funds tracker is really a backward look, right? And I know you've been at OMB for some time, and I think in fact you've been at OMB even before the earliest data that we have in the tracker. And so I wanted to get a sense from you. We're all advocates here, right? So we all find a place to put our weight behind, but the issues around the fiscal state of the city right now is a issue that's been around for multiple administrations, as you've heard. It extends city to state and even federal responsibilities. In Brad's highlights this morning, we talked about just the dwindling federal and state share of the budget and how the city has had to step up. I'd love for you to help us appreciate a little bit from where you sit, what you view the state of the city's fiscal situation, and why it's important to keep in mind this historical trend.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I think one of the numbers that really stood out in Brad's presentation is like over I think it was a 10-year timeline or something to 2011, you see a substantial drop in federal and state revenues into the city budget. And so I started at OMB in 2008, like a week before I think the Great Recession was called. So I've seen the state of the city budget really change over time. And one thing that really started, I think, around 2010, 2011 is significant cost shifts that we started seeing annually in the state budget. And so and a lot of the federal money that comes to the city actually comes as a block grant that goes to the state, and the state can determine the rules of how local governments can draw down those federal funds. And so what we saw since about 2010, 2011 is every year there'd be some kind of formula change. It would say TANF, for example, used to be 25% city, 25% state, 50% federal. And then it changed in favor of, so the higher cost share for the city. Same thing for safety net. Used to be 50-50, now that's the state's version of welfare. And so now that's 71% city, 29% state. So there's been this, and it builds over time. So that might be 1 year's budget, but that's the new baseline. And then the next budget comes out, and then there's more of these shifts that happen over time. So it's something I think about a lot, is like you see this disinvestment of other grants that come from our partners in the federal and state government, but oftentimes, and more often than not, the city actually makes up the difference. So while those federal and state dollars have gone down, the city had to replace that. It's almost often because it's a mandate or something that mayors and administrations have prioritized as, we're not going to accept that cut in the state budget, so we're going to backfill it with city dollars. And so I think as I look back over time, it's something that it's kind of like, what we could have done if we didn't have this disinvestment from the state and the federal government in our social and human services network. What more could we have done with that city resource that would have been available to us if we didn't have to use it to backfill a cut to a critical program? Generally, I mean, I know everyone's familiar with what's going on with the city budget right now, but I think if you look back over time, and one of the questions was, what is the state of the sector compared to how it was when I started there? I think you cannot compare. You know, I know folks are struggling right now, and I'm not diminishing any of those concerns, but when I look back at when I started, there wasn't much of an interest in expanding the safety net and enhancing it. And over that time, we have been able to do things like create model budgets, with, you know, Chai was a part of when he was at OB, and do things like the indirect cost rate. And so I feel like that we've been able to maintain over time, while at the same time having to backfill all of these state and federal cuts. And I'll just end with, I think that going forward, in terms of how do you use this data for advocacy, for understanding, you know, what's happening with the sector, with the city budget, it's important to know that kind of nuance, because I don't think it makes sense for the fiscal viability of the human services sector in New York City to be 100% reliant on the city. The city is a major player and very important, but we should not be letting the federal government and the state government off the hook for their role in providing the resources to maintain and keep our safety net flourishing and actually moving the ball forward and addressing these problems. So I'll just end with that.
Very good.
Thank you, David. Louisa. So one of the things I definitely appreciated in preparing for the event is the difference, right, between, you know, the city's estimates and IBO's estimates at times during the budget cycles. I would love for you to share with us, from your perspective, the value of having an independent entity like IBO, and also like what different contexts are you pulling from when you put out information regarding the budget?
Thank you, Raisa. So the Independent Budget Office is a city charter created agency. And part of the charter states that the IBO has access to any city data source unless there's personally identifying information. Which means that when we do a report, we look like inside, behind the walls, as opposed to other people who have to use public data. It also means that at times there are fierce and respectful debates with, for example, OMB, looking at what might happen and what has happened. So IBO's challenge is to be as transparent as possible with the data so that people understand how we're coming to the math we're coming to, and also to help a broad audience understand the complexity of what we're talking about. We do 3 reports a year. Basically, every time there's a major budget action, IBO, same as the Comptroller, does a sort of compendium report. And sometimes we're looking forward. So in the November plan and the January plan, we're predicting how the economy will be and what the revenues will be. And we're also looking at what the city, what the administration is talking about expenditures, and seeing whether we think whether there needs to be a repricing, if the math adds up a little differently. This year in November, IBO redid what we believe to be the state of the economy, and so we had a really different fiscal outlook than the administration that was using their outlook from April. Everyone was really transparent. April was a different time than November. April, there was still a pretty major question as to whether or not the city would be entering into, or the country and the city would be entering into a recession. And there are some enormous costs right now to the city that were not expected. Most obviously, the end of the stimulus funding, which is a federal issue, and the cost to New York City for asylum seekers, which I think one could really say is partially federal, because they're not really at the table, and partially state, because they're a little bit at the table, and also partially city insofar as choosing how to address the issue. There have been really major changes since November, and most obviously that the city has changed its update, so now our numbers are pretty much in line with the administration's, and also that there's some changes going on in the asylum seeker overall cost expectations. So that's sort of the overall, the different role. Now, if you wish to ask IBO to do something, Eric gets a plug IBO. We have a website that will punish you, but soon we'll have a better website. It's a great website from like 2001. But the point is, you can email us or you can go on there and contact us, and we take questions from the public and answer them. We figure out, do we have the data? If we don't have the data, can we get the data? And we are at least try our very best to give people short or long answers. So, for example, we were asked to look at cities. Perhaps we were asked to recently look at the cost to the human service workers if they had gotten the same raises that DC 37 city employees had gotten. I'm just trying to think of some reports that we've done recently that are relevant to the sector. We also do lots of other reports. Stormwater fees, a very interesting topic, but maybe not to this sector. But the point is, we have the data, and our job is to help the public, to empower, and so we're there for you, and we look forward to that. We also did an important report last March, and that was on this shifting, this is a sign of which direction, cost share from the state. So David's polite. I work for the state. It's a strategic decision, given the budget cycle. State does its budget first. They can choose to lessen the ratios or the amount of money that the city gets, and surprisingly, it started when just about someone was elected governor for the first time. Who could that have been? But there was a strategic decision to lessen the level of aid from the state to the city, which impacts all of us in every area, not just human services. Something to really pay attention to, and for us to think about sort of as a collective voice, is that where we believe New York City should be.
Thank you, Louisa. Sharon, I'll go to you. I'd love to hear your perspective on, what this all means for the sector, particularly the human services workforce, right? We know, we've heard it time and time again, FPWA recently released a report that shows that what we already know, the data confirms that there are roles within the human services sector that are disproportionately, disadvantaged from an income adequacy perspective. I'd love to hear from you what you can pull from this data, what this means, and how did it translate into your specific role related to pay equity.
Thank you for that question. First of all, the funds tracker data shows the systemic divestment of funding in human services, right? And secondly, the bottom line is that it shows, especially for women, the human services sector, the majority of individuals that work in the sector are women, primarily women of color. And it really highlights a and structural issue when it comes to the sector. So a few months ago, WCC really tried to explore the gender pay gap in New York City and what the cause of it, what drives it. We partnered with the new school, the New York City, the Center for Public Affairs, right? And in the research, and what they found is that gender pay equity across New York City has stalled for over 25 years. For over 25 years. I can give you the stats on gender pay, especially among Black women, Latino women compared to white women and white male. There's no coincidence that this stalled pay equity, when you look at the divestment over 12 years, right, in the human service sector, you can see that in terms of funding, you can see that there's a major challenge here. What's driving the pay gap is that women occupy low-paid occupations in the city, including the human services sector. When it comes to home care, and I could share some stats with you, the fact is that it's the fastest growing low-paid industry in New York City. 56% over the last 20 years. And it comprises 10% of the city's workforce. That's about 400,000 individuals in the city. 333,000 are women and women of color, right? So when you look at that, there is a lot of challenges there, especially when it comes to income, when it comes to supporting your your family, and with an average wage of about $30,000, the women in the sector, especially in home care, relies heavily on support services, wraparound services, safety net. And as we saw with the divestment of federal funds, we're now down to $10 billion about. We see that this funding supports a lot of the safety net, child care, right? Health benefits, housing, all that child care services that women need to support their families. Also, when it comes to the CBO community that is contracted with the government, the fact is wages have stalled there as well. And at least 1/5 of the human services workers rely on some form of government assistance to support their families. This is critical in terms of not only supporting families, but it's also supporting the individuals in, that the human services serve. So the funds tracker, by highlighting this, we now understand that we have to have advocacy at multiple levels of government.
Yes.
Not just the city, not just the state, but the government, the federal government as well, because that's the main source of funding for human services programming. And so we'll talk more about potential solutions, but I wanted to highlight that. Not only that, but also since the 1970s, the government has outsourced services, as we heard this morning from Brad, to private sector individuals, right? And so leaving poverty wages for community-based organizations who are doing the work on the ground and that is familiar and have lived experience with the community we serve. So thank you all for pulling together this funds tracker, because information is power, evidence-based data is power, transparency and accountability is power, and so it gives us an opportunity to equip. By the way, if I didn't say it before, the majority of the human services workers are women, and they're women of color. So thank you for that data, and we will definitely be using it.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Chai, I would love for you to just kick us off with solutions. So we've heard already, right? We know the data confirms the city has had to step up, right? And the city often cites the dwindling funds that is confirmed through the data for making or recommending what can be really harmful cuts to the sector and to the services that the sector delivers. I'd love to hear from your perspective and where you're sitting right now. What do you see as possible solutions that the city can do to ensure financial stability?
So I want to go back just a little bit and put where we are right now into context from the nonprofit perspective. We have never seen a year like this where the administration announced in September a 15 across the board cut to all city agencies or programs to eliminate the gap. I try not to use that term in public too much just because it's only we know what it means or use the term. But it's a budget reduction. You know, everybody had to file 5% savings in November, 5% in January, 5% in April. That could come through multiple ways, but some of it did come as direct cuts in this fiscal year. Some of it came in out years. So, you know, this was as we've heard many times, there are multiple drivers of the budget gap that we were seeing. This, from the last testimony we heard from OMB, it was a $7 billion gap that they needed to close for this fiscal year. So, one thing we all knew was that federal aid was going to dry up. And I'll talk a little bit about the federal aid and kind of the context and what that equips us to be able to do in terms of advocacy. You know, the other were decisions that the administration made in terms of what to prioritize in paying and continuing to pay, in addition to the previous administration. And then the other is what everybody talks about a lot in the public, and that's continuing arrivals of migrants to New York City and increased costs. I think that our solutions have always kind of been the same. Like, since I started this role in 2019, we've gone through a few major crises. Some of them that dealt, like we tend to only do budget advocacy for special moments like this, when it's sector-wide. So in 2020, revenue fell immediately when everything shut down. A lot of our members started to get concerned about what that would mean for their contracts immediately. So we coordinated some responses, and one of the areas that supports a lot of, in particular, BIPOC-led smaller organizations, culturally specific, linguistically specific organizations, is discretionary funding, and there was a big discussion about how that might be cut in the upcoming fiscal year because revenue was down, so we did a campaign around that. And then when the state started to withhold 5% of contract payments, they just weren't paying because revenue was down in the state, and they actually can do that, and they suspended some of the prompt payment laws because of emergency conditions. We did another campaign, and we actually looked at revenue raises, which I know FPWA is very farther along in terms of a position on that. Where we are as Nonprofit New York in the Y15 campaign, which since September has really been asking, why 15%? Because we have other great data sources, IBO included, is one of the data sources we've been citing that says there are contending positions on what the need is, and do we really need to do this right now? And where's the transparency, where's the analysis? Because our members were all very, very concerned. But why I say that the solutions always kind of are the same is that all along we have said we need to be treated as partners in this. Like, organizations that are contracted to do the government's work need to be viewed as partners. They need to be part of decisions. They have tremendous expertise on what's working and what's not working. We have to look at a lot of different data sources. We're not naive about the challenges we're facing, but the decision came out. We started to ask everybody, what are you hearing? What are you hearing from agencies? Nobody was hearing anything. We heard a couple of anecdotes about things that might get cut. But then when we all basically had to wait in November to see, okay, what actually got cut. And things did get cut. Services were cut for New York City in this fiscal year. I think the biggest agency to take a hit, 2 rounds in a row is DCLA. So the cultural organizations, the arts organizations are like, we're waiting until our panels in February. If you're not part of the CIGs, we're waiting for our panels in February to see what happens with our money this year and next year. The Compass youth programs through DYCD, they received their contract cancellations about a week ago. So even, the mayor has said that things are restored and things are preserved, things were cut, and organizations are preparing. So these, the DYCD providers are preparing to tell families with children with special needs that their after-school programs will not be available starting in June. So this is the context where it's like, we heard about the announced thing. We asked all of our members what they're hearing. We have to wait till the budget document comes out, take a look at it, and then months later, organizations start to hear about what it'll mean for their funding. So it's just, we need to be part of the solution. We need to be partners. We can think strategically about revenue. We have done that before. I went to DC and talked with a congressional delegation about federal relief. I went to Albany and talked with the state about state relief. I mean, and just a little bit more context for that, like, why I think that this data is helpful and really important is because we know that the share of state and federal aid has gone down. We know that we need federal relief. We know that we need a federal response to a national crisis, and we need coordination. So it is reasonable that the governor has announced that $500 million will be moved from the emergency reserve to support New York City. That makes sense, given how much we provide to the state, given how much we provide to the federal government. I think it's going to be really important to watch what happens over the next couple of years, because before 2020, New York was paying more to Washington than we were getting back. We would get 91 cents back on the dollar that we paid to Washington. Every state that changed in 2020 because of COVID, because of pandemic relief. But that's expiring, so we'll see what has to happen the next couple of years. But I don't know, I mean, in addition to all the things that I think FPWA is looking at in terms of revenue raisers, it's time to start talking about that. There's other solutions we can think about in terms of the formulas, but we have to understand how all that is working. Very long way to say. There's a lot of things we could look into.
Thank you. I want to stay there a little bit. I think, it's important, again, given your multiple diverse perspectives. Our goal is, again, to raise awareness, right, to increase budget transparency, and to really equip the sector with necessary data for its work. And I'd love to hear from you, what you see as potential opportunities for collaboration. How do we use this moment to work together to kind of, and where are those opportunities most ready? And it could be for all of us, so dive in.
Well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity right now because the governor just put out her budget proposal, and everything should get wrapped up by the end of March if things go on schedule, and sometimes they don't. But I think it's an important time, and it's a good opening that there weren't that many. I didn't see really any significant clashes. I was surprised, and there was a good number of new resources that were added that would help the city on the cost of the asylum seeker. Still a little bit less than we were hoping, but it's a good starting place. And I do think that it is important as we're thinking about difficult decisions and how do we move forward if we have to make cuts, hearing from the perspective of providers and what does it mean for them. And I've been personally doing that during these different rounds of cuts, is hearing from CEOs of different nonprofits, like, if you had to make a reduction, how would you prefer to do it? And just hearing that perspective and having those conversations with agencies to see, if we have to do this kind of stuff, how are we doing it in a way that preserves the core of our programming? So I think that now, and it's a good time to be thinking about how we get more from the state. And then on the federal, I just want to add one more point there. It's just that what we've noticed is that we only really tend to get increases in federal support when there's an emergency, right? And so it's important, you know, I know it's difficult with this kind of Congress and the balance is so fragile but we do need to get to that place where there is sustained federal support that is not just a reaction to a pandemic or a hurricane or some kind of other emergency, but there's this forward-thinking federal investment that helps the city and our sector.
I just want to pick up on what David said about trying to get sustained funding from the federal level. I'm going to just speak to two solutions from the top and the bottom. So in terms of the top, my recommendation, if one doesn't exist, and not to my knowledge it doesn't, we need a joint task force with both the city and the state to really identify resources at the federal level, both discretionary and other, right, to be able to pull into the state. And what I mean by that is, for example, the Biden administration had allocated about $2 billion for infrastructure funding, technology infrastructure funding. I remembered reaching out to the city to say, you know, are we going to go in with the state to be able to at least put in a proposal to be considered? And at the moment, I think because the city was dealing with a change in administration, so much going on at the city level, we did not have the bandwidth or the capacity to be able to pursue that. And so I think there are opportunities that could be done by having an intentional body that really looks at how do we secure sustained funding, but also discretionary funding from the federal government. Secondly, in terms of community, I had the opportunity of working in DC and going up on the Hill. And often what I saw there was the healthcare folks came out in droves. They were consistent in knocking on doors and advocating for what they needed. The human services sector, not so much. And I understand why. Because we're busy with limited resources serving our communities. But we need that collective civic power, that collective voice to be able to consistently, working with FPWA and others in the room, to knock on doors and to use our collective voice and power to be able to advocate for increased investment in policies that will increase those investments. Because I can tell you, working at the national level, the state level, and the local level, there's such a disconnect in terms of what's really happening on the ground. And for example, the true cost per of serving an individual in the human services level. We often sort of not fully articulate the full cost because sometimes it doesn't make a difference, and sometimes it will be that's too high of an investment to make. But I would say that we need to be very clear, and the funds tracker will help us to be able to articulate what is the full cost and what has happened over the years in terms of trends to be able to invest. So collective impact, collective power, civic power, and being able to be intentional about leveraging those funds.
Thank you. Sharon, Louisa? Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Okay, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, just in terms of collaboration, one thing. So there's a few like we can tap into the infrastructure that's being built or has been built. So you know, under the previous administration, we had the nonprofit resiliency committee task force. I don't remember what the final thing was, but it was a way for the city to engage with providers on the policy changes that were happening. And now we have the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services. I have to put on my advocate hat and say that the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services, we're glad we have a direct line to the city in that way. They've set up an advisory committee. The process was not democratic. I was part of one of the kickoff meetings, and I noticed that there were no arts and cultural organizations represented. They took a $20 million reduction in this fiscal year, and they're very anxious about what that means for them. So I think that the more information we can get, the more communication we can get from the city, and we're happy to convene that, we're happy to facilitate that, but one of the things that I asked in that meeting, they were like, what could we do? I said, we need budget briefings. Every agency needs to, if they can, do a budget briefing on the status of their budget right now and what it might mean for existing and future contracts. Organizations are very, very ready to provide the information about what it'll mean and what they can do. Another example I heard recently was about a DFTA RFP, the Department for the Aging, where they released an RFP that had a caseworker salary of $40,000. And that has been the case for, they were like, this has been adjusted for how many years? And the providers are like, oh my gosh, come on. Like, what can we do? Like, how can we say this is not livable in New York City and we don't want to apply for this for our workers? And as Sharon mentioned, we know who that disproportion falls on. This is a racial equity issue and this is a gender issue. So more information, more collaboration, we're prepared to do that.
Thank you. Louisa? Until 9 months ago, I was an advocate. I have to remind myself that I'm not an advocate anymore. But the Independent Budget Office does have values and is committed to transparency. It also has underlying values of equity. And so part of the challenge we have is separating our own personal, intense values and opinions from the larger, what the data tells us, but also being out there with data at a speed that allows it to be actionable. And we've been doing an enormous amount of work towards that goal in the last year. I just want to reiterate that the speed of this budget cycle is such that it's a really fast situation. There are only weeks between a budget coming out and the appropriate city council action to move something forward. And what we're trying to help is both understand the overarching, what's the story here, and specific questions. So our mission is to move the policy conversation forward. We're happy to try and help in any way we can with data. But the only caveat, the only footnote I have to say is if you ask us the question and we go forward, sometimes the answer is not at all what people expected, and we'll put it out anyway because the data doesn't lie. So occasionally people say, "Oh, don't say we asked for that. That's not the answer we wanted." The city has to have a balanced budget. The state has to have a balanced budget, and there are choices that are made. And our goal is to bring transparency and help the policy conversation move forward. So we're here to help, but you may not like what we tell you.
Thank you all. I have, to be honest, quite a few additional questions I could ask. But in the interest of time, I'd love to open it up to those who have stood with us. We have time for about 2 to 3 questions. My fearless leader wants to ask one, so of course I have to pass her the mic.
Thank you. Very much appreciate this very rich, thoughtful conversation. One, I want to say 2 things. The first is a comment that is a response to the question you asked about how we can better collaborate. And the second is a question for you all, perhaps a controversial question depending upon where you sit. So New York City now, in connection with the passage of racial justice measures, building on some work that FPWA actually began back in 2021, concerned about the purported benefits cliff, we began looking at the incomes of individuals across the state, not just New York City, but across the state, and realized that even with the increase in wages, that there were many people who were still struggling. We also appreciated that the current self-sufficiency standard is not sufficient in terms of capturing the actual true costs for New Yorkers, especially persons of low income. We do not yet have that measure. It has now been mandated, the change in the charter, to create a true cost of living measure. We're very excited about that. We're leaning in with the city and partnering with the Community Service Society. We're looking at what more can be done at the national level to affect a true cost of living measure. So we're quite excited about that. Once that measure is actually created, it will only be beneficial if it is used and utilized to inform and shape policy and decision making. And so when we talk about, like persons who are providing human services, when we talk about contracting, when we talk about people on the receiving end, one of the ways that we can collaborate is when that true cost of living measure is adopted. It has not yet been adopted. We do not yet have, whatever you may have heard, we do not yet have in New York City a true cost of living measure. The self-sufficiency standard is not a true cost of living. It's a bare bones assessment. It is not the true cost of living measure. Soon we will have one. And collaboratively, collectively, we need to use that measure to inform, help shape and inform policies and practices, including contracts with human service providers for people, largely of color, in the main women, who are providing these critical services. So that's a comment. Long-winded, sorry. Quick question. So, and related. So, we hear the buzz. Oh, well, what if the sector were unionized? Might we be in a better place? When I appreciate the historical trends, I can't help but think when we're looking back and seeing that funding has been decreasing, not just in the last 2 years, not just in the last 6 years, but 10 years plus. We're not the only ones looking at the expenditures and how the sector has responded. So is it easy to just kind of keep going that route? Because it's been happening. Oh, well, this mayor did it, this administration did it. How bad can it be? And the sector hasn't really walked away. Or, nobody is kicking sand, or they say we're not. So let's just keep doing it. I've had people in the administration say, why don't you just unionize? You got a stronger voice if you unionize. What are your thoughts about that?
Should I start?
Sure.
Okay. So Nonprofit New York we don't have a position on whether the sector should unionize. I think partly because we represent so many subsectors, and some of our members, they're all volunteer. There's no paid staff. And then we have, gigantic, the Metropolitan Museum is a member of us. So it's a huge range. When I think about objectively me, doing advocacy work, working for the city, all these things. When I'm working on legislation, it always helps to have union support. When you're in these spaces, in the halls of power, we know we have less power than the unions. We know that. We have less power than the C4s. So there are reasons for that. Because money is power, being able to endorse is power. Those are all true. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
It's something I think about a lot when there's these conversations, and I'm really, this is purely a personal opinion, but I think one of the reasons is for having a unionized nonprofit sector is that they would have a bigger voice at the table and able to push their agenda forward and get to those issues of cost of living and not just constantly just trying to catch up with COLAs. I would push on that and say I think that it would be amazing if the sector could just take the approach of unions and form coalitions and really push for their agenda. It's so complicated when we look at how do we shift titles of different nonprofit. I've looked at it myself, okay, this person's a caseworker, and then this title I'm not really sure, is it DC 37, is it this? And it's so messy. At the end of the day, I just throw my hands up and I'm like, if we wanted to just do this, why don't we just do a COLA like we had in the past and just make it something meaningful? Because also at the same time, when I do look at some of the salaries of some unionized folks, they're still pretty low. And so I don't think that it's the panacea that we're thinking of where we need to go. It's certainly an interesting idea, and I go back and forth with it a lot, and I debate my former colleagues and current colleagues on what to do, but I really think that building on what is in existence is probably the cleaner and faster way to deal with this issue.
I just want to quickly say that the human services system is very fragmented. And I think often, and I'm looking at my colleague over there, Greg, from the New York City Employment Coalition, is that every time, we go to advocate for something, it is based on where we sit. And I think I would probably dodge the question around unionization, but I will say that because of the fragmentation in the sector, we do need to have that collective voice and that collective power. And if unionization is an option for that collective power, that collective voice, then I think it's important. But regardless of whether it's union or not, the fragmentation do us a disservice. And so the more we can come together in advocating and advancing these issues, that's what's really important at this point. And that's what the unions have that we don't.
Okay, so I used to work for an organization that was unionized and that supported many nonprofits that were unionized, that founded their unions. And the pay parity issues in the city were still present because it was the city government making decisions through contracts, not looking at whether or not the workforce was unionized, but rather making contract decisions through other mediums. So in that circumstance, the campaign for pay parity wasn't based on unionized, not unionized. It was based on titles across workforce, whether one was working for the city or working for the nonprofit sector. As I said, IBO, proud union agency. I'm in a union household. I read the UFT newsletter, which is really interesting. On our advisory board, we have strong union leadership, and I think that I echo your remarks. There is incredible power in the collective voice, but I don't think that that should be the barrier to bringing the sector more together. I think that it can be both ends. Some are, some aren't. And in the meantime, there are basic equity issues and living in New York issues that just simply need to be moved faster than, massive cultural changes.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question. Yes.
I think my husband tells me I have a beautiful outside voice, but I'll use this anyway. My name is Diana Breen, and I stabilize nonprofits in transition by serving as interim ED and CEO. I have a question for the panelists. I'm so curious, what data aren't we measuring that we should be measuring? What should we be reporting on so we can better serve low-wealth New Yorkers? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I think that some of it hopefully will come with improvements in Passport. We have long wanted to be able to have public data sources where we could easily analyze wages within contracts for workers, contract structures, like, what are the indirect rates? Is that publicly information? I know when I say that, I hope it's a big deal for a lot of people, and So being able to see that, and then also, I think the last time I saw Passport Preview, this is possible, but I don't know how, and that's to disaggregate between if a contractor funding is going to for-profit versus nonprofit. That's a really big conversation right now in the discourse about how our city is managing the migrant arrivals. So all of those hopefully will be coming soon. That's really important data. And then I'll just do a plug for some research we did. We did a report that came out in 2023 called Every County Across All Budgets, which showed that in terms of the nonprofit sector, leadership is disproportionately white. White people are overrepresented in nonprofit leadership in every single county, in every single budget size of organizations. It was the most consistent finding for New York City. So when we talk about who are the people who are bearing the brunt of suppressed wages, it's people of color. We know this, and if you think that it's an issue that we need to have more representation in leadership, then I think that we also need to see what that looks like for funding to organizations that are contracted with government. Like, what are the demographics of the leadership? Oftentimes, that's information that the government and philanthropy already ask us. We fill out demographic surveys a lot of the times about our staff, but it's not publicly released. I think that would be really, really helpful for all of us.
Thank you, Chai. That was super helpful. Anyone else want to chime in? If not, I can add a little bit from my perspective. Again, to plug the tracker, it's a great question, and it's one that we keep asking ourselves here at FPWA. And we've had several iterations of the data tool this year. As you've heard, we are comparing revenues with expenditures, but one of the things we want to also do is compare that with demographic needs. And I think the issue of like really being able to compare and overlay our expenditures with where the need is, I think is going to be another valuable tool. With that, I have to say thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for sticking around. I think it's been a great day. I myself have learned so much from each of you, not only from your time with us this morning, but even in preparing for this event. So I just want to thank you for your time. I also have to, I won't say or repeat a lot of what we've already learned throughout the day, but would just, again, thank you all for joining. Download our report, use the dashboard. We're going to be able to learn and grow from, how you interface with the data. We're here as a resource to you all, and we want to, again, in the theme and spirit of collaboration, work with you all to make this tool even better. I have to end by plugging, again, as Jennifer started the morning, giving a shout out to FPWA staff. When I tell you it was a all hands on deck effort, it was. And so each of you, thank you so much. Let's use the rest of the time. If you can stick around, let's talk to each other. Let's, use what we've learned today. We have food and refreshments if you want to stick around. Thank you so much.